Thank you. Thank you, Colleen. Well, it is a delight. We've had a good week here already where I got to teach in the evenings on the mind of the mystic. So in some ways, I hope whatever I can try to say this morning will be a continuation of that and a deepening of that. I was very excited by the title they gave me because I think if we can in any way in this hour clarify it, open it up, it can bear invaluable fruit, not just in our own lives, but I think for the future of Western Christianity. We've got to get this notion straight because I don't think it's much of an exaggeration to say we haven't had it real clear. In fact, the very term Enlightenment, I bet if I asked, most of you in the room would identify it with Eastern religions. It's like it's not even our word. And maybe I pray that I can make it somewhat clear that it should be our word, but maybe an understanding of how we lost it and how we can regain it. So let's start with the prologue to John's Gospel, John 1:9, where he says, "The Word is the true light that enlightens all people." So there's already this God as light, and yet the light passes over to people. So it's something we receive, we participate in. John, the 8th chapter, says, and this passage you're certainly familiar with, "I am the light of the world. Anyone who follows me will not walk in darkness, but will have the light of life." Light, as you know, is normally connected with seeing, with our capacity to see truthfully beyond shadow and disguise. Then in Matthew 5, the Sermon on the Mount, again he makes very clear, Jesus, that we participate in this light. You are the light of the world yourselves, and your light must shine before people. Now, Jesus also uses the term in a very similar way to Eastern religions as a shift in one's seeing. Not that we see special things, not so much what we see, but how we see. And that's what teachers of contemplation are trying to make clear, that contemplation is not simply being pious or churchy or even prayerful. It's an alternative consciousness. It's a different pair of glasses by which you see the moment and by which you see the world. And unless that lens changes, there really is no enlightenment. Because we keep looking for the correct information, but we don't have the eyes with which to see that even correct information, so we usually distort it. So it's more than anything else, in the long term, our capacity to see differently. This is made clear later on in the Sermon on the Mount, where Jesus says, "The lamp of the body is the eye. If your eye is sound, the whole body will be filled with light. But if your eye is diseased, your whole body will be filled with darkness. In fact, if your inner lamp is in fact darkness," in other words, you think you see, but you really don't, what darkness that will be. Because if you don't get your seeing right, you'll distort the most sublime piece of theology or dogma or doctrine or sacrament or Bible or priesthood or whatever it is. You'll misuse it. You'll use it, frankly, for purposes of ego and superiority and separateness, not for the union that all religion is rightly leading us toward. Perhaps there's no story that illustrates this better than that marvelous chapter, John 9, "The Man Born Blind," that we read a couple weeks before Easter each year. It's almost a theater piece in which the blind man becomes, and of course this is common in all ancient mythology, where the one who sees is blind, to show us that it's not what we think it is. So the man born blind becomes the symbol of one who can in fact see. And if you remember the text, he's presented in contradistinction to the religious leaders who claim to be enlightened but cannot see at all. So making it very clear that enlightenment is not the same as religious office or religious title or what we would call ordination. It is for judgment that I came into the world, so that those without sight, the little ones, as we might say, as Jesus often says, are those who see. And those who think they do see will be shown to be blind. What a judgment on organized religion. To the Pharisees who want him to assure them, well, you're not talking about us, are you? He doesn't miss a beat. He says, blind, if you really were, you would not be guilty. What we call culpable or not culpable blindness. But precisely because you say, we see, your guilt remains. Precisely when you're so sure that you know it all, that you have the truth. John 9 seems to be saying that's almost a certain sign that you won't have it. We speak in our men's rites of passage of beginner's mind. And the assurance that someone will keep growing all their life is to forever have this humble beginner's mind, that life is always out in front of you with a sense of awe and wonder and allurement, drawing you forward to the next level of the mystery. Because as we know, if God is mystery, which God certainly is and always will be, then this mystery is infinitely understandable. I love to quote St. Augustine in the 4th century, who said, Si comprehenderos non est Deus, if you comprehend it, it is not God. It could not be God. You wouldn't respect a God you could comprehend. But after our food fights since the Enlightenment, we've tried to prove that we have certain truth and have pretended that we actually could understand mystery. It would seem that that's the great descent of historic theology, when we dare to undo the central concept that keeps us humble. So this turning around, because you say we see, your guilt remains, is what some call turning the tables theology, or the great reversal. Jesus sums it up so often, the last being first and the first being last. Then for a moment, let's look at Paul. In the letters of Paul, or at least sometimes letters attributed to Paul, he often uses the word light and darkness, but in various ways. And to be perfectly honest, some of them are quite similar to Carl Jung in the 20th century with his notion of shadow. Be children of the light. Things which are held in darkness, and we know the shadow self is not necessarily the evil, but that which we're not willing to see. We don't want to see. We don't know how to incorporate. It's too humiliating to recognize that maybe I'm not a loving person, or I have over-control needs, or whatever our thing might be. Things which are held in darkness are things that people are ashamed to speak of. But a beautiful line, anything exposed to the light will itself be illuminated. And anything illuminated itself becomes light. We would call this in modern psychology the whole phenomenon of mirroring. And that it's the situation where we really don't know who we are until someone mirrors us to ourselves. And this light that God is, when we allow it to reveal to us, we're afraid it's going to reveal just the dark things. In fact, it dismisses the darkness and shows very often that what looks like darkness is often our very light. Where you stumble and fall, Carl Jung said, there you find pure gold. In 2 Corinthians, he says, I use this in the frontispiece of the book on the Enneagram, Satan disguises himself as an angel of light. In other words, or as Thomas Aquinas put it, one can only get away with doing evil, any of us, if for some reason we explain it to ourselves as virtue. Everybody who does wrong thinks in their own distorted perception that somehow they're saving the world or helping others or making the world safe for democracy or whatever. We've always got a rationale to justify our violent spirit, our hateful spirit, our cold spirit. That's the nature of the ego. It will never admit to itself, which is why it's hard for us to apologize that we're doing a bad thing. We've all got our justifications. Satan himself disguises himself as an angel of light. And I'm sure you've been told the very word Lucifer means the light bearer. It looks like light. It looks like the answer. And if you don't have true light and go to the deeper level, you end up doing evil in the name of good. This is almost, brothers and sisters, the story of history. So it seems to be saying that there is such a thing as false enlightenment. Again, the repetition of the John 9 theme. Most strongly in John's first letter, 2nd chapter, he says, the real light is shining, and anyone who claims to be in this light but still hates his brother or sister is in the darkness still. So if you're in the light, quite simply, the test becomes love. An enlightened person is a loving person. If you can't love, you're not in the light. It really is that simple. If the flow isn't happening, then the light isn't shining. If the light is shining and you are holding the light, then the flow will not be stopped of this eternal love. You know, brothers and sisters, what's helping us like never before to reclaim this image of light is quantum physics. For centuries, of course, we thought that for some terrible reason, science was our enemy or our competitor. And now, of course, in the last 20 years, like never before, scientists seem to be again and again our best friends. Now we know, for example, that light is the one constant in the entire universe. It literally is omnipresent. And even those things that appear to be dark, which is apparently 95% of the universe, dark matter or black holes or dark light, as it's sometimes called. In fact, we can now prove scientifically that what looks like darkness to the human eye is in fact filled with photons of light. And what the early mystics and even the medieval mystics said, everything is light, is in fact now proven to be scientifically true. And what sin might be described as is our unwillingness to draw upon that, to trust that, to allow that, to be that, which, of course, to be that which we already are. Now, despite these scriptural beginnings and these later scientific affirmations, another word than enlightenment or light largely dominated the Christian West. And this word, which we're all familiar with but don't necessarily understand, is of course the word salvation. The word came from the word for healing or health, solace. And we see in the New Testament there's the healing of sin, healing from sickness, which is just all about Jesus. That's what he does all the time. The healing of relationships, healing through the cross, the healing power of forgiveness. I used to work back in the 70s with the wonderful Dominican Francis McNutt, who wrote that first book, some of you remember, in the mid-70s called Healing. And he told me at several conferences, he said, Richard, you wouldn't believe the hate letters I get for writing a book on healing. And he said, one of them recently said to me, healing. What are you talking about healing? We Catholics don't heal. He said they didn't realize what they were saying. He said, the letter said, this is something Protestants do in a tent. And of course, they were half right, even though unkind. Healing, brothers and sisters, solos, which is just about all that Jesus did, was really not a part of our vocabulary. In fact, you older Catholics will remember, we pretty much pushed it off in literature. When the priest appears in the novel, you know it's the end of the line. It's not good news. And the word that we used gives away our bias. Extreme unction. Extreme unction. There was little interest in what Jesus did, touching people, transforming people wherever the pain was. And I point out to you, which you'll see is obvious, when you go to the New Testament, Jesus has no prerequisites for who he touches. He doesn't check out what religion they are, what denomination, whether their marriage is annulled, whether they're gay or straight or black or white or Catholic or just, Jesus, Son of God, have mercy on me, and he touches them. You cannot find a single story where Jesus has a prerequisite. And it's amazing that we made it a series of hoops to jump before Jesus could possibly touch us. So what happens, of course, and this was the loss, it seems to me, of a live, transformative religion. In general, the way most of you, if you were raised Catholic, grew up understanding the word salvation is that it came to be the cover-all word, right, for the final definitive healing that was experienced after death that made you right with God, you see. So once that happens, you simply can't experience it at any transformative level. And very quickly, I'd like to point out how in the New Testament, there are 3 different kinds of passages. Some which point out that salvation has already happened. Some that point out how salvation is in the process of happening, which is where it gets its dynamism from. And there is a finality and future tense to it. Let me just give you several. Past tense, God has been pleased to reconcile all things to himself, whether on earth or in heaven. Colossians. By grace you have already been saved. Ephesians. The grace of God has appeared and has already brought salvation to all. Titus. Romans, perhaps the most beautiful. This love has been poured into your hearts by the pure gift of the Holy Spirit. Now, without that well to draw upon, that what Paul calls in other places this pledge, this guarantee, this inner source, this promise, we'd call it the indwelling presence of the Holy Spirit. Brothers and sisters, it comes with the manufacturer, all right? It's clear in the very first verse of the Bible. The Spirit is hovering over the chaos, waiting to descend. And yet, I don't know what the clerical bias is. Is it the eternal carrot on the stick? But we can say without any doubt that all the texts that emphasize the gift of salvation has already objectively been given have been the least taught in Western Christianity. It was always holding it out in front of you. I cynically say sometimes, I think, for us clergy, it has to do with job security, you know. It keeps you coming back, you know. We just keep holding it out. No, you don't have it yet. There's no objective presence to call upon, to draw upon, which takes away the whole dynamism of the experience. And frankly makes what happened, the gospel, into a worthiness contest at which nobody wins. You have to split. You have to pretend. Because who of us ever ever feels worthy. And so it became, to use Brian McLaren's wonderful phrase, salvation or enlightenment largely became an evacuation plan for the next world, right? It's nothing that changes people now, that they enjoy and draw upon now. It's all something that if I jump the hoops right, I might get it later. Huh? This has done the gospel no favor. This has done grace no favor, which is always free, always unearned, and always poured into our hearts gratuitously. But there are the present tense passages. John 1, the true light which enlightens everyone is coming into the world. Or 1 Corinthians, those of us who are being saved are experiencing the power of God. It's still a dynamic process. Or Philippians, work out your own salvation with fear and trembling. This keeps us on the journey, keeps us with that eternal sense of mystery and becoming. And there certainly are the passages of future tense. 1 Corinthians, as all die in Adam, so all will be made alive in Christ. And I, when I am lifted up from the earth, will draw all people to myself. John 12. This is a plan for the fullness of time, to gather up all things in Christ, things in heaven and things on earth. First chapter of Ephesians. The notion of the cosmic Christ that began at the great Big Bang, as we now call it. You know, I love to tell people this. This was, of course, very Franciscan theology. Our John Duns Scotus would have said that the incarnation did not begin with Christ, Jesus. That was the human incarnation. The incarnation of Christ, in fact, began with the Big Bang. The moment God decided to materialize, we have the eternal Christ, the coherence of matter and spirit, which has existed since the beginning. If you think we're making that up, try the prologue to John's Gospel, the hymn in Colossians, the hymn in Ephesians, the first chapter in John. They all say the Christ existed from all eternity. And in a moment of time, this eternal Christ mystery, so we could fall in love with it and see eye to eye, became a person that you and I believe is Jesus. Again, we did not do the gospel any history or any favor in history by simply making Jesus the whole mystery of the incarnation. Because what happened is we didn't take ourselves seriously. We didn't take the planet seriously. We didn't take nature seriously. We didn't take animals seriously. Nothing was really in this great sweep of salvation except us. And then what happened when we whittled it down, the great chain of being got whittled down to human beings alone were being saved, then we ended up having a 2,000-year food fight deciding who of the humans even got it. And hardly any of the humans ended up being worthy enough or belonging to the right denomination or having the water poured at the right time with the right words and by the rightly ordained priest. So we argued about things like this instead of the foundational Enlightenment experience itself, where it's observable, where it's seeable. Brothers and sisters, it doesn't take a lot of genius to see an enlightened person. It's sort of Christian common sense. There are people who they flow. They glow. They change. They change others just by being who they are. Every one of you in this room can tell a transformed, enlightened person. It's not some secret hidden away. And of course, Jesus says that you can't claim this as a trophy. You can only live it. And your light will shine forth for all to see. It's observable. They will see your good works. It will bear visible good fruit in the world. You will be a generative person, to use Erik Erikson's term. You look for opportunities to serve, to care, to make a difference. You don't just keep checking your salvation list of sacraments received and masses attended, which sometimes, as a priest of 40 years, it seems to me is often an actual obstacle, because you make that the goal when it isn't the goal. All religious institutes, Bible, sacraments, priesthood, vestments, candles, holy water, pick the one you like or don't like. They're all just fingers pointing to the moon, but they're not the moon. And as I told my class this week, we've spent too many centuries arguing over who's got the best finger. Who's got the one holy Catholic apostolic finger? That's all ego. I've got the right finger. You've got the right finger if it's pointing you to the moon and getting you to the moon, and you can experience the moon. And unless that experience transforms you, I'm afraid the institutes of religion become again and again and again more a part of the problem than they do in any kind of real solution. So, I've been drawing recent years upon the work of a lesser-known name, a man called Owen Barfield. I am actually in writing correspondence with his grandson. Owen Barfield is called the thinker who was behind the thought of J.R.R. Tolkien, C.S. Lewis, and T.S. Eliot. I mean, those English minds that just seemed to get the big picture and to be desirous of communicating it in an exciting way. And Owen Barfield had a wonderful distinction that now is being rediscovered in what we're calling the participatory revolution. At least that's a word Bruno Barnhart uses. That religion is not an experience of observation of something over there. And if you understand it, and you agree with it, and you affirm it, then you're saved. We can't get by with that anymore, because it isn't true. It just isn't true. Religion as attendance, religion as a spectator sport, watching the right theater pieces, watching the right sacraments observed validly is somehow of itself going to transform me. He says, daringly for his time, and I'm sure many people would still want to call it New Age or pagan, but he believes, because he believed that the incarnation began with the Big Bang, the original creation theology, that God was clearly revealing God to all of God's creatures since the creation of the world, which is stated, by the way, in Romans 1:20, if you want to check it out. God was there for the eyes to see in everything that God has made since the beginning of time. Romans 1:20. At any rate, he called this early experience available to the Stone Age people, to the people maybe we call barbarians or pagans, as if they were all just throwaway people. Had you ever thought of that? God created them, that women, children, families who came into this world just like you and I, but throw away. I'm just waiting for Roman Catholics to come along. No? Don't care about them, don't need them. Millennia of useless people. How it's incomprehensible anybody can accept that and think that God is great, which God clearly is. But anyway, this older period before about 500 BC, what Karl Jaspers calls the axial period, he calls original participation. That he believes, and maybe this is shocking to some of you, that people through nature, art, music, dance, poetry, sexuality, already participated in the eternal mystery. And in fact, he was of the mind that probably they were often more psychologically healthy than we are today. We can't prove that. But they had that sense of everything belongs, and I belong. And I'm a part of this mystery. I'm participating in it. I'm not watching it or trying to earn it or trying to get it after I die. It's flowing through me and in me right now. I am it, and it is me. That's the great moment of conversion, when that becomes a living experience. And he called that original participation. Then, around 500 BC to the birth of Jesus, or the time of Jesus, we call the axial period, in which period most of the great world religions find their thought and foundation. Great philosophies emerge, literature emerges. We move into a higher level of consciousness, it seems, where we can reflect upon the mystery, and we learn to write it down in minds like Plato and Aristotle and the Greek tragedies, and writers actually in India and China and all over the world. And then he says that this comes to what he believed was a great fullness in our Jesus. And he says Jesus came to live and to announce full and final participation, and that the kingdom of heaven is already among you. It's already happening. This was already true, but we were finally willing and able to believe it, conceptualize it, participate in it, and enjoy it. And he says, although Jesus promises full and final participation, which is a step beyond, perhaps, original, primal participation, it seems to have always been a minor theme in most of Christianity, because we kept the carrot on the stick out in front of everybody else. The word we use for it are the mystics. Those who went, mystic for me simply means experiential religion. Don't make it a high and mighty word that's beyond any of you in this room. The moment the veil parts and you have even a moment of unitive experience where it's all connected, where it's all real, and it only needs to happen once. Once you've had unitive experience, you have the foundations of an entire mystical life. You know something experientially that you can't know in any other way. Now, Barfield says, and you can make a good argument for this. In fact, as a teacher of contemplation, we see this is what we're up against. He calls the last 500 years the desert of non-participation. Now, that doesn't mean everybody was lost for the last 500 years. But, and this is not in any way to criticize the necessity of the Protestant Reformation, but once Europe divided and got into oppositional, adversarial thinking, Germany divides between Lutherans and Catholics, and they have to waste the next 200 years proving that they're totally right and the other group is totally wrong. You have the death of contemplation, the alternative consciousness. You can't see things in the broad field. You can't go to the deep level because you're adversarial. The adversarial mind cannot know God. It always divides the field of the moment into either and or. That's much of the import of my last book, to try to reintroduce to the West what I think Jesus first offered us, non-dual consciousness, where you don't split things between what I already agree with and what I don't yet understand, and I call that wrong. It's the basis of all racism, sexism, war, homophobia. It's actually the tortured mind that most Western people live with. And this is why Owen Barfield says we have lived in the desert of non-participation, where there wasn't this inherent sense of being belonging to something or connecting. Let me tell you a personal story that brings this home. I told it to my class this week, if they don't mind hearing it again. In 1985, I was invited by the abbot at Gethsemane to give the 8-day retreat to the monks. I lived in Cincinnati at that time, so often drove down to Gethsemane to make my own retreats. And they got to know me, and I got to know them. But, in '85, I still had hair, and I looked like a kid. And I said, who am I to give an 8-day retreat to these venerable old monks who are 10 times holier than I? So I thought what Catholics always think, when you don't have a lot of inner authority yet, what you do is you quote outer authority. The Pope said, or the Bible said, or Saint so-and-so said, because you don't have enough inner experience to say, I say, the way Jesus talks. So the first day of the retreat, maybe the second lecture, I raise my authoritative Franciscan finger and I say, as Thomas Merton said, surely thinking this would win the entire crowd to my favor. I mean, the whole world reads Thomas Merton. He's the man. He's the most important Catholic of the 20th century in many people's judgment, who is translated into all the major languages of the world. But I notice when I raise my authoritative finger that it isn't working. That some of these venerable heads go down, and some growl. I didn't think monks would growl, but they do. And some found something very interesting out of the windows on the left. I always say this is the male form of passive-aggressive behavior. When they don't want to hear you, they look away. They literally look away to show you they're not listening to you, But I didn't get it the first time, so I tried it again the second day. And I said, as Thomas Merton said, again, scowling and so forth. So the third day I asked Brother Bruno, who was a friend of mine, now deceased, and I said, Bruno, am I doing myself any favor by quoting the great Thomas Merton in his own community? Because I was beginning to think this is a prophet not being honored in his own country, or the typical male game of competition and jealousy. And this is what he said. Now you'll get it. This is a quote. He said, no, we didn't like him originally. And he said, many still don't like him, as you could tell. And the reason we didn't like him, now mind you, these are men who've given their whole life to be contemplatives. This is my self-image. I'm a contemplative. He told us we were not contemplatives. We were just introverts. Yeah. The fact that you laugh shows you understand. And all the religious in this room, and laity too, we've all suffered from this. This making you think because you were introverted, you love Jesus more. And because you just like to be quiet. Actually, you hated people. It wasn't really, in some cases. And what Merton was pointing out, as he almost single-handedly recovered the older contemplative tradition and pulled back the veil, he says, the West no longer teaches contemplation as an alternative consciousness. In fact, most religious themselves, which is why a lot of us gave up on prayer, we tried to pray with a dualistic mind. That's not contemplation. Contemplation is you stop dividing the field of the moment. You let it be what it is, as it is, without adjusting it, correcting it, judging it. That takes practice for Western people, especially if you're educated. Because education largely means being better at dualistic thinking. That's all. You make more clear distinctions why you're right and other people are wrong. So you can see why Owen Barfield said, we have been in the desert of non-participation. He perfectly paralleled Merton. He says, we no longer understand that the contemplative mind is a different mind that does not read the moment in terms of us and them, right or wrong, black or white, gay or straight, Catholic or Protestant. It is. Now you can see what detachment from your own ego that necessitates. To let each moment be what it is without pigeonholing it, without putting it in some category, up or down, in or out, with me or against me. If we don't learn this, brothers and sisters, I don't think our politics is going to change. People really think Democrat and Republican is a significant food fight, when they all buy the same basic worldview of capitalism. There's no kingdom of God, big picture understanding of things. You've got to basically accept the rules of the game and live inside of that. And even our church, utterly divided between liberals and conservatives, both convinced that the other has nothing to tell them, which is never true. And of course, the contemplative is the only one who can know that, because they do not divide the field of the moment. So, what are we saying? What, therefore, is the meaning of Christian enlightenment? I have to say, at least on paper, apart from the Western mystics, the church which best maintained it and taught it was Eastern Orthodoxy, at least on paper. It's not that they necessarily all got it or all lived it either, but you certainly find it in the Eastern Fathers of the Church. And the word in English was translated the process of divinization, right? And this divinization, theosis in Greek, was with you from the beginning, was a process of ongoing appropriation, drawing upon this interior gift, this indwelling presence that is objectively and equally given to all of creation, all creatures, and then, yes, does come, we believe, to an even greater fulfillment. So your Eastern mystics, especially in the first 4 or 5 centuries, just revel in this, revel in the pure gift of God. And if you read the mystics of Eastern Orthodoxy, it's always the language of light, 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 living in the light, drawing upon the light, enjoying the light, being light. And the nice thing about light theology or Enlightenment understandings is it seems to me to have a better ability to incorporate the body. That it isn't all in the head. One, like Simeon, the new theologian, one of the Eastern, he said, I look at my poor finger, and even my fingers are filled with light. You begin to understand this Christ mystery, this being Christed, is not something limited to the brain, or least of all to the left brain, but to the soul, to the spirit, and even to that least redeemed part in unfortunate Western theology, the body itself. Once we don't understand enlightenment as a communication of real light at the cellular level, at the emotional level, at the bodily level, at the sexual level, we get into the terrible split that we've suffered so much from today. Once we can begin to live in this true self, as Merton would have called it, who we are in God, who God is in us, then we become, to use that wonderful phrase from 2 Peter, 1st chapter, sharers in the divine nature. Sharers. This is the participatory revolution, right? That we are sharers in the divine nature. I think probably it was simply too good to be true. And so we had to push it off into the future. And you see, here's the problem, that when we tried to understand Jesus, who I believe was the first clear non-dual teacher in the West, with largely dualistic theology in most of the centuries, and the non-mystical theologians who are always, it seems to me, reveling in dualism, there's several important things you cannot do with the dualistic mind. In fact, they're most of the important things. You know, all of our great doctrines and dogmas are the overcoming of a paradox. Jesus is totally human and totally divine at the same time, right? That's the Christ mystery. That's the principle of incarnation. That's what makes our religion unique. I bet Ron Rolheiser, when he was here in earlier years, said what he often says, and he doesn't mean it unkindly. I surely agree with him. He says, most Christians are not Christians. They're theists. They believe in a supreme being who made all things. They answer the theological question, and they push Jesus into the role, even though he doesn't fit in many ways. Christians are not people who believe there's a supreme being who made all things. Right? The unique trump card that we have, the unique message of Christianity is that matter and spirit coexist, always have and always will. This is what makes a Christian absolutely unique. But when you read the gospel with a non-mystical, non-contemplative, dualistic mind, you don't have the software to process that. You can't. And here's what happened. For all practical purposes, and be honest, most Christians believe Jesus is only divine. We're actually monophysites. He pretended to be human, but we don't know how to put it together because the dualistic mind can't put it together. It's a paradox. It's a contradiction. And the price we paid ourselves, for all practical purposes, you are only human. We couldn't put it together in Jesus, and so no surprise, we can't put it together in ourselves. Brothers and sisters, this is our big message. Without this, Christian religion has little transformative power. It's simply an evacuation plan for the next world, all right? Where you can be racist, just get it right in the last 10 minutes of your life. That's all. You can be hateful, you can be greedy, you can be militaristic, you can buy the entire system. And this is why Christians in many ways have not changed the world. Christian nations have not been known for being unwarlike, please. Can you find any examples? Ungreedy, can you find many examples? We usually lead the pack. And it's not that it's our fault. We didn't know how to do it. We gave people commandments that in great part they could not understand, much less obey. You try to love your enemies with a dualistic mind. Try it. You can't do it. Have Christian people or Christian nations been known for loving their enemies? I don't think so. Jesus seems to be loving the poor every other story. Has Christianity been known? Yes, our saints. For loving the lower class, the outsider, the immigrant, the excluded one. No, we've been the excluders more often than not. That's pretty well documented. But I want to say as strongly as I can, it's not that our people were bad people. We just lost our own pearl of great price, our own gift, our own alternative consciousness, our own experience of enlightenment. That we have an inherent identity in God. St. Catherine of Genoa used to run through the streets of Genoa, I'm told, crazily shouting, "My deepest me is God, my deepest me is God, my deepest me is God." That's the moment of conversion. Until you know that, nothing's really going to change. God stays out there and you remain unenlightened. This eternal and infinite source that we can draw upon, maybe we called it the soul, maybe we called it the Holy Spirit, creates in us a new pair of glasses, a new way of reading not just ourselves, but everything else. And that set of eyes can deal with exceptions, contradictions. It can forgive, it can understand, it can be compassionate. It doesn't search for perfect order. Please don't take my word for it. Go to the Gospels. Where was Jesus an insister upon perfect order? He deals with disorder. He has no trouble with disorder. He doesn't care if they're Syro-Phoenician or Roman centurions or lepers or prostitutes. All the people outside his system, he goes right toward them. Quite simply, Jesus goes to wherever the pain is. Not where the theoretical truth is, where the pain is. That's a very, very different gospel. And thank God it includes all of us. It utterly levels the playing field because, brothers and sisters, we all have pain, if we're honest. Now there's no superiority system to enlightenment. There's no worthiness contest. There's no climbing the ladder of moral achievement, hoping one day we'll get there when no one really does. We let God come to us the way Jesus came into the world, into the place of the wounds and the place of the pain. I'd like to end with one poem, maybe two, because I've learned after so many years of trying to preach and teach that prose is almost by necessity dualistic. And so it just sets people up to, I agree with him on that, I don't like that. You know, it's all the judging mind takes over, I like that, I think he's heretical there. You know, it's just, you get nowhere. You know? Whereas poetry doesn't allow you to do that, you know, because we know we only half understand it, if we're honest. And so the soul and grace are able to fill in the gaps. And we're a little more patient. We're not so judgmental. We don't push the river quite as much. We let the river include us in the flow. And the two poems I'm going to use are from probably a lesser-known poet to many of you, a man named William Stafford. The first poem is called The Way It Is. And it's from his book of poetry called The Way It Is. There's a thread you follow. It goes among the things that change, but it doesn't change. People wonder about what you are pursuing, and you have to explain about the thread. But it is hard for others to see, especially if they haven't grasped the thread themselves. It is hard for others to see. But I tell you this, while you hold it, you can't get lost. Tragedies will happen, people will get hurt or die, and you yourself will suffer and get old. Nothing you do can stop time's unfolding. Just don't ever let go of the thread. So, this talk of enlightenment and salvation is telling us that there is a thread. It's already in you and flowing through. You're already connected. You're already inherently connected by what Bede Griffiths would call the golden string. And your only job is don't let go of it. Don't doubt it, really. And everything militates against believing that there is a thread, because we all get caught up in the externals and successes and games of the moment. And so we have to find some spiritual practice. Silence and solitude are still the best. Some understimulation, so you keep being conscious of the thread that's already there. You don't create the thread, as he says. It's already there. But you have to explain to other people about the thread. People wonder what you are pursuing. There is a thread you follow. It goes among the things that change, but it doesn't change. Salvation is telling you that there is a golden string, and you are already strung up inside of it. Let me give you one more, and we'll end on this, also from William Stafford. He says, "You reading this, be ready." That's the name of the poem. You reading this, be ready. Starting here, right now, salvation is always now. If you don't get it now, you know what? You're not going to get it when you go to Mass tomorrow. Do you know that? You're not, because you're going to bring the same mind to Mass tomorrow that you have right now. So you might as well get it now, you know. Starting here, what do you want to remember? How sunlight creeps along a shining floor? The scent of old wood, how it hovers. A softened sound from outside that fills the air. Will you ever bring a better gift for the world than the breathing respect that you carry wherever you go right now? The breathing respect. And I'm going to stop in the middle of the poem to give what I try to give to every group in the last 5 years. It's the second chapter of the Naked Now book, but if you might not get that, let me tell you about it. I was at a conference on science and religion and consciousness a few years ago. There was a Jewish rabbi teaching who was also a scientist. He said, you Christians, you never understood the commandment, do not take the name of the Lord thy God in vain. You thought for some strange reason it meant you're not supposed to say, God damn you. He said you shouldn't say, God damn you. That's not a very nice thing to say. But that's not the meaning of the commandment. The meaning of the commandment is don't use the name of God at all. We don't know how many centuries, he says, we observed it, but we knew that the sacred name Yahweh was never to be pronounced with our lips. What humility at the beginning of religion. What Jewish genius. Don't talk about it, because then you'll think you understand what you're talking about when you use the word God. So don't use it. And during that period, we developed the words Adonai and Elohim for the name of God. It was only the Jerusalem Bible, many of you remember, in the 1960s, that started daringly using the word Yahweh. And Catholics in the 60s used to say, who's this Yahweh? I knew this much as he went on to teach, that when you write Hebrew, you only write the consonants. And what it means to be an educated person is your mind automatically fills in the appropriate vowels. He said, do you know that when you correctly pronounce the consonants used in the sacred name, it in fact does not allow you to close your lips or to use your tongue? In fact, if you perfectly pronounce the word Yahweh, it will imitate the sound of inhalation and exhalation. Oh my God. This could change your life. I hope it does. It changes your prayer life, because this means you've been praying, maybe not consciously yet, since the moment you came out of your mother's body. And there will be a final stating of the name of God before you die. Then, you're only the second crowd I've told this to, because I just learned it last month. In Chicago, I had a Muslim in a class, a Sufi Muslim. And he said, do you know our sacred name, Allah? Do you know what it means? I said, well, it's your word for God. He said, Al, A-L, is the same as the Spanish word for el, or the. When you put a second L behind it, it means the very. And then behind that you put an apostrophe and the H. He said, literally, the sacred name for God is, listen closely, the very. That's the meaning of Allah. The very. Now let's go back to the poem. We didn't know God was this accessible, did we? We didn't know that God was as available as the breath. And to remind you, there's not a Catholic or a Protestant way of breathing. Did you know that? There's not a Catholic, or there's not a Chinese or an American way of breathing. There's not a gay and a straight way of breathing. There's not a black and a white way of breathing. It's available and given like grace itself. And you could almost say we were afraid to be human, we were afraid to breathe. Will you ever bring a better gift for the world than the breathing respect that you carry wherever you go right now? Are you waiting for time to show you some better thoughts? And we all are. It's always out in front of us. When you turn around, starting here, lift this new glimpse that you have found. Carry it into the evening. All that you want from this day. This interval, these few moments we've now had together. This interval that you spent reading or listening to me, keep it now for life. What can anyone give you that is greater than this right now? Starting here, right in this room, when you turn around. Thank you.